There is an invisible architecture in every human interaction, a web of power that precedes any word, any gesture. In ancient times, when social structures were more crude and selection mechanisms more evident, human predators did not need psychology manuals to identify those they could devour. They had something older, more refined, a hunting intuition shaped by millennia of social evolution. They did not choose at random. They never did. Each victim was selected with the precision of an artisan who recognizes the exact crack where to apply the chisel. What we call cruelty was, in reality, efficiency. What we term evil was simply the ruthless application of deep knowledge about human nature. The social predator of antiquity understood something that modernity has wrapped in euphemisms and psychological theories, that every human being carries in their behavior the complete cartography of their vulnerabilities. The selection of victims was never an impulsive act. It was an art, a dark science practiced in the markets of Athens, in the Roman legions, in medieval courts, in every structure where human hierarchy manifested without filters. The predator watched. It always watched first. In the public squares of Rome, a slave trader could distinguish within minutes who would break quickly and who would require more elaborate methods. He did not look into the eyes seeking fear. That was obvious, too superficial. He looked at the shoulders, the tilt of the head, the speed of blinking when someone else raised their voice. He sought the pattern of previous submission, the trace of past defeats engraved in body language. A slave who had been broken before was infinitely more valuable than one who still retained his pride intact. The mark of prior domination was like a quality seal, a guarantee that the process of submission had already begun long before the predator appeared on the scene. Experienced gladiators in the Colosseum developed a similar instinct. They could identify in the arena, among dozens of fighters, who would die first. It was not a matter of physical strength or skill with weapons. It was something more subtle, more lethal. They observed how a man held his shield when no one was attacking him yet, how he distributed his weight on his feet during the seconds of waiting before the fight. Fear was not the indicator. Everyone felt fear. The indicator was resignation. That fraction of a second when the muscles relaxed in anticipation of defeat, when the mind had already negotiated with death before the sword touched the flesh. A veteran gladiator knew that the real fight did not happen between bodies. It happened in the microscopic space between intention and action. And he who had already lost that internal battle was just meat waiting for the verdict of steel. This predatory wisdom was transmitted without words, from generation to generation, refining itself with each conquest, with each empire that rose devouring its neighbors. The Vikings who raided monasteries did not choose their targets on a whim. They studied coastal communities for months, sometimes years, before the first attack. They identified settlements where social cohesion was weak, where internal disputes were evident, where authority wavered. They did not attack the richest fortress, but the most divided. They understood that a fragmented community is simply a collection of individual victims pretending to be a group. The ancient social predator had discovered, long before any modern psychologist, that true power does not reside in brute force, but in the ability to detect and exploit the fractures in the social fabric of its prey. The selection techniques were multiple, and all shared a common characteristic: reading signals invisible to those who had not cultivated the predatory gaze. In medieval courts, an experienced noble could identify in a single dinner who would be their next political victim. They observed who laughed too loudly at the king's jokes, revealing anxiety for approval. They noticed who avoided eye contact with certain guests, exposing hidden conflicts that could be exploited. They recorded who drank faster when delicate conversations began, indicating that their psychological armor needed to be chemically reinforced. Every gesture was an involuntary confessional. Every poorly chosen word was a map to the vulnerable center of their psyche. The predator did not need their victim to reveal secrets. They only needed to observe how they reacted to the possibility of those secrets being discovered. But perhaps the most sophisticated mechanism of selection was the one operating in the realm of social isolation. The predators of antiquity intuitively understood what modern neuroscience confirms: that an isolated human being is exponentially more vulnerable than one connected to a support network. In medieval villages, witches were not chosen randomly. They were selected following a meticulous pattern: women without family, widows without children, healers living on the margins of the community. Not because they were truly dangerous, but because they were dangerously vulnerable. The accuser knew that a woman without a protection network could not mount an effective defense. Her cries of innocence would bounce against the social void surrounding her. The ancient predator had learned that the community does not protect everyone equally. It only protects those who have the social capital to demand that protection. The others are sacrificable, and the predator simply carried out the implicit verdict that society had already issued by marginalizing that person. This understanding of isolation as vulnerability was applied on massive scales. The empires that conquered new territories did not massacre indiscriminately. First, they identified ethnic, religious, or tribal cracks in the conquered population. Then, they systematically amplified these divisions, turning entire communities into archipelagos of isolated groups who looked at each other with more suspicion than at the conqueror. Rome perfected this technique until it became imperial doctrine. Divide and conquer was not just a military strategy, it was a technology for selecting victims on a civilizational scale. By fragmenting potential resistance, they transformed entire populations into individualized victims who could be processed one by one, tribe by tribe, without ever organizing a coherent opposition. The social predator had discovered that the best way to devour an army was first to convince it that it was not an army, but a multitude of individuals with irreconcilable interests. There was also selection by exhaustion, a technique that the feudal lords applied with clinical mastery. They identified peasants showing signs of extreme wear, those whose crops had failed 2 consecutive years, whose families were weakened by illnesses, whose tools were broken beyond repair. These were not attacked directly. They were placed in a position where the only way out was voluntary servitude, an impossible loan to repay. Attacks increased just when there were no resources to cover it, a minor accusation requiring legal defense beyond their reach. The predator understood that an exhausted person is not only easier to dominate, but also more likely to rationalize their own defeat as a logical decision. The exhausted victim signs their own sentence of slavery and calls it pragmatism. The predator doesn't even need to force the cage, just wait patiently while the victim builds the bars with their trembling hands. Ancient monasteries and religious structures provided some of the most fertile environments for refined predation. Not because they were inherently corrupt, but because they concentrated elements that the social predator recognized as ideal: rigid hierarchies, unquestionable authority, isolation from the outside world, and most importantly, victims who had been conditioned to suppress their self-defense instincts in the name of higher virtues. A novice in a medieval monastery had been conditioned to interpret submission as piety, silence in the face of abuse as humility, and acceptance of suffering as a path to sainthood. The religious predator did not need to break the will of their victim. The structure had already done that. They only needed to redirect that preconditioned obedience toward their own ends. The ideal victim is not the one who fears resistance. It is the one who has been convinced that resisting is immoral. This perversion of authority structures revealed something fundamental about the nature of social predation: that the best hunting grounds are not places of chaos, but places of excessive order. Battlefields produce victims, but they are random victims, difficult to predict and control. Highly structured institutions, on the other hand, produce standardized, manageable victims with predictable vulnerabilities. A slave in a Roman mine, a serf on a feudal estate, an apprentice in a medieval guild. All shared a characteristic. They had been placed in systems that first stripped them of their individual agency and then made them responsible for their own oppression. The social predator learned that the best victim is one who has internalized their victimization as a natural part of the order of things. The merchants who trafficked in human beings along the Silk Road developed entire taxonomies of vulnerability. They could assess the value of a potential slave in minutes, not by their physical strength, but by more subtle psychological markers. A person captured far from their homeland was worth more than one captured near their community, because the geographical distance was psychological distance from any rescue identity. A person who had witnessed the violent death of their family was worth more than one captured alone, because the trauma had already done part of the work of psychological disarticulation. A young person was worth more, not for their capacity to work, but for their cognitive malleability, for the ease with which their identity could be rewritten. The commercial predator had understood that the true product was not the body, but the psyche, and that a fractured psyche was infinitely more valuable than an intact one, because it was easier to reformat according to the buyer's needs. This industrialization of victim selection reached its most refined expression in the caste systems that emerged in multiple ancient civilizations. India, Japan, medieval Europe, all developed elaborate taxonomies of degraded humanity, where certain groups were designated as eternally vulnerable by decree of the cosmos. The perverse genius of these systems did not reside in the violence with which they were applied, although that violence was omnipresent, but in how they turned depredation into a morally neutral act, even virtuous. If someone was born untouchable, then exploiting them was not cruelty, but fulfillment of the natural order. If someone was declared a heretic by birth, then persecuting them was not injustice, but a religious duty. The social predator had achieved its greatest triumph, making the victim accept their own selection as legitimate, as part of a divine or natural plan that was blasphemous to question. The gladiators who survived multiple fights developed an almost supernatural perception of these patterns. They could distinguish between the condemned who would fight for their life until the last breath and those who had already internally negotiated the terms of their surrender. The difference was not in courage. All the men in the arena had courage. It was in something deeper, whether they still retained a sense of personal agency. The dangerous condemned was the one who still believed that their actions could alter their destiny. The condemned man was surely the one who had accepted that his fate was sealed and that fighting was only an obligatory ritual before the inevitable verdict. The predator-gladiator quickly learned to identify this fatalistic acceptance. It manifested in micro-expressions, in the way the eyes followed or did not follow the movement of the weapons, in how the shoulders tensed or surrendered at the first exchange of blows. It was the difference between someone who fights to win and someone who fights to fulfill. And that difference was everything. But there was an even more valuable victim category for the old social predator. Those who not only accepted their victimization, but actively defended it. The slaves who watched over other slaves. The oppressed who became oppressors of those just one step below. The peasants who denounced other peasants to the feudal lords in exchange for tiny concessions. These collaborating victims were the lubricant that allowed the entire mechanism of domination to function without constant supervision. The social predator had discovered that the best way to maintain a system of exploitation was not through perpetual violence, but through strategic redistribution of small amounts of power. Give a slave authority over 3 more slaves, and you will have gained a guardian who will supervise their own slavery with more zeal than any external master. The ancient predator understood that the perfect victim is not the one who suffers in silence, but the one who finds meaning in their suffering by becoming an administrator of others' suffering. This psychology of complicity was masterfully exploited in the military conquests of antiquity. Alexander the Great did not conquer the world only with Macedonian phalanxes. He conquered it by incorporating the local elites of each invaded territory into his power structure. He offered them the opportunity to betray their own people in exchange for maintaining a portion of privilege under the new regime. Most accepted. Not because they were cowards, but because the predator had correctly identified their central vulnerability. They preferred to be privileged collaborators rather than dismissed resistors. The imperial predator understood that each society has a fraction of its population willing to sell out the collective future for present individual security, and that identifying and cultivating that fraction was more efficient than any military campaign. The judicial systems of antiquity were extraordinarily efficient tools of selection. The laws were not blind. They had a meticulously calibrated selective vision. In democratic Athens, only citizens had full rights, a minority of the population. Medics, slaves, women existed in legal zones where their bodies and properties were essentially freely accessible to those who held citizenship. The law did not protect. It classified. It designated who was a legitimate predator and who was legitimate prey. The genius of the system lay in its appearance of justice, in how it wrapped systematic predation in language of order and fairness. The legal predator was the most sophisticated of all because it operated with the seal of social approval, transforming exploitation into an administrative process, cruelty into a judicial procedure. This legalization of depredation reached particularly refined forms in Rome. Roman law is celebrated as the foundation of Western civilization, but it was simultaneously an exhaustive manual on how to identify and process legal victims. The categories of personae non grati, enemies of the state, rightsless barbarians, debt slaves, all were designations that transformed human beings into legitimate targets for exploitation. A Roman citizen with debts could be reduced to slavery through a process called justice itself. A captured enemy could be publicly tortured under the label of civic entertainment. The Roman predator had perfected the art of making the victim participate in their own destruction by signing documents, accepting verdicts, recognizing the legitimacy of the system that devoured them. The pirates who infested the ancient Mediterranean developed a practical understanding of these dynamics that rivaled any philosophical theory. They knew that merchant ships did not defend their cargo with the same ferocity. Some crews fought to the death. Others surrendered at the first threat. The difference was not the value of the cargo, but the composition of the crew. Sailors who had been mistreated by their captains, who worked in conditions of semi-slavery, who had no share in the profits of the voyage, those did not risk their lives for Chujie goods. They surrendered quickly, sometimes actively collaborating with the attackers. The experienced pirate did not ask what the ship was carrying. He asked how they treated the crew. A ship where the crew was exploited was a ship that was conquered with threats. A ship where the crew had a stake in the profits was a ship that required real combat. The maritime predator had learned that the best way to predict resistance was not to assess military capability, but social cohesion, and that a divided crew was simply a collective victim waiting to be processed individually. This wisdom about cohesion as defense and division as vulnerability permeated all spheres of ancient life. The generals besieging cities not only cut off supplies, but also cut off information. They prevented different sectors of the besieged city from communicating with each other. They spread rumors of betrayal, secret surrenders, private negotiations between the enemy and certain internal factions. The city did not fall because of hunger. It fell because of paranoia. The military predator understood that a community that does not trust itself is a community that has already been conquered. Only the physical walls remain to confirm what the psychological walls have already accomplished. The ideal collective victim is one where each member suspects that everyone else has already secretly negotiated their surrender. Slave markets were psychological evaluation theaters where every gesture was scrutinized with clinical intensity. Buyers not only inspected teeth and muscles, but also observed micro-behavior patterns. How the slave reacted when another slave was beaten nearby. Whether they showed solidarity or indifference. Whether their eyes followed the attacker with hatred or fear. Whether their hands clenched into impotent fists or remained limp in resignation. Each reaction was an indicator of what kind of work they could perform, what type of supervision they would require, what probability there was of attempting to escape or rebel. The sophisticated buyer knew they were acquiring not only work capacity, but a complete psychological profile, and that this profile determined the return on their investment much more than any physical attribute. The commercial predator had industrialized soul reading, turning human vulnerability into a classifiable and marketable commodity. Ancient religions, with all their narratives of redemption and divine justice, also functioned as systems for identifying victims. Priests could designate any individual as possessed, heretic, or cursed, and that designation was enough to make them a legitimate target of community violence. The accusation did not require proof. The proof was the accusation itself. If the gods had allowed you to be accused, then you must be guilty of something. This circular logic transformed entire communities into potential hunters and each individual into a potential victim. The religious predator operated in a particularly fertile psychological territory because its victims had been conditioned to believe that suffering was proof of spiritual guilt, that if they were being punished, it was somehow deserved. The spiritual victim was perhaps the most tragic of all because they actively participated in constructing their own guilt, searching their past for any sin that would justify their present torment. This internalization of guilt was a tool that the social predator perfected over millennia. It is not enough to dominate the body. It is necessary to dominate the narrative that the victim constructs about their own experience. Slaves who believed they deserved their slavery due to some moral or karmic fault were infinitely more manageable than those who correctly identified it as external injustice. The servant who interpreted their misery as divine will was more obedient than the one who recognized it as a structure of exploitation. The ancient predator understood that the most effective cage is not built with iron, but with meaning, with narratives that transform oppression into destiny, exploitation into natural order, cruelty into cosmic justice. Roman amphitheaters were public laboratories where these dynamics were displayed with obscene clarity. The condemned were not only executed, but were forced to participate in elaborate stage scenes of their own destruction. They were given useless weapons and made to fight against professional gladiators. They were dressed as mythological characters, recreating scenes from legends where their death was the pre-established narrative climax. The audience not only witnessed executions, but also saw the transformation of human beings into disposable accessories of mass entertainment. The imperial predator had discovered that violence was more satisfying when wrapped in spectacle, when the victim not only died, but died playing a role assigned in a narrative that justified their death as an inevitable aesthetic conclusion. This aesthetization of cruelty was not an aberration, but the logical culmination of the entire victim selection system. Once you have identified who can be devoured, once you have built the legal, religious, and social structures that legitimize this predation, the final step is to make that predation not only acceptable, but desirable, entertaining, even edifying. The social predator reaches its most refined form when the audience not only tolerates victimization, but pays to witness it when cruelty becomes culture, and exploitation becomes a spectacle that defines collective identity. The ancient philosophers, of course, rationalized all this. Aristotle argued that some humans were slaves by nature, that their inferiority was ontological, inscribed in their very essence. Plato built ideal republics where the lower classes existed solely to support the philosophical contemplation of the upper classes. The Stoics preached acceptance of the assigned destiny, transforming resignation into virtue. The intellectual predator played a crucial role. It provided the conceptual framework that allowed victims to rationalize their victimization and perpetrators to sleep peacefully after their atrocities. Philosophy did not challenge the system of predation. It refined it, made it more sophisticated, more difficult to identify and resist. The trade routes connecting Europe with Asia were also routes of depredation, where the weak were systematically filtered and processed. The caravans crossing deserts and mountains did not operate under principles of solidarity, but under brutal Darwinian selection. If someone fell ill, they were left behind. If someone could not pay for their protection, they became merchandise. If someone showed weakness, they were immediately reclassified from travel companion to exploitable resource. The nomadic predator did not need state structures to operate. They carried with them an instinctive understanding that every long journey reveals who has reserves of strength and who is operating at the limit of their capacities, and that this revelation was simultaneously an opportunity for exploitation. This exploitation reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the debt systems that permeated the ancient world. Lenders did not offer credit-seeking repayment. They offered credit-seeking default. Interest rates were designed to be unpayable. The terms were deliberately ambiguous. The goal was never to recover the loan, but to acquire the debtor. An indebted person was someone who had already been captured. Only time needed to complete the process of transferring ownership. The financial predator had discovered that it is not necessary to hunt violently when you can set traps where victims capture themselves, where their own needs push them into contracts that guarantee their eventual slavery. The learning and education systems in medieval guilds operated on similar principles. An apprentice signed contracts that bound him to a master for years, sometimes decades. During that period, his work enriched the master while he received barely subsistence. If he tried to leave, he was marked as a deserter, and no other guild would accept him. If he completed the period but was not accepted as a master, he had donated years of his life without acquiring the status that would justify that donation. The system was designed to produce many perpetual apprentices and few masters because the existing masters needed cheap labor more than professional competence. The guild predator had institutionalized the exploitation of youthful ambition, turning the desire for progress into a mechanism for extracting value. The colonial conquests that began in antiquity and extended into the modern era simply industrialized and globalized these techniques. The Spanish conquistadors in America did not invent new forms of depredation. They applied European technology to the same principles that had worked for millennia. They identified divisions among indigenous groups and exploited them. They selected local leaders willing to cooperate and turned them into administrators of their own people's exploitation. They used religion to make conquest seem like salvation. They employed debt and dependency to transform self-sufficient communities into captive populations. The colonial predator was simply the updated version of the ancient predator, equipped with better weapons but operating with the same fundamental understanding of how to identify and process human vulnerability on an industrial scale. This historical continuity reveals something disturbing about the nature of social predation. It is not an aberration, but constant. Every civilization, every era, every power structure has developed and refined its own systems of victim identification and processing. Methods change, technology evolves, language updates, but the underlying logic remains identical. It identifies vulnerability. It isolates the victim from their support network. It creates narratives that legitimize exploitation. It makes the victim participate in their own victimization. It turns the process into a system, the system into an institution, the institution into culture. The social predator of antiquity did not disappear. It simply learned to wear a suit, to speak in corporate language, to hide its mechanisms behind contracts and legal structures. But the gaze remains the same. That gaze that assesses vulnerabilities, calculates resistances, and precisely identifies where to apply pressure to obtain surrender. Now, the lingering question is not whether these mechanisms existed in antiquity. That is historical, verifiable, and incontestable. The real question, the one that pierces the comfort of analyzing the past from the safe distance of the present, is entirely different. That perspective we described, that ability to read vulnerabilities, to identify isolation, to recognize when someone has been preconditioned for submission, to detect when a person has already internally negotiated the terms of their own defeat. That perspective still exists. It is operating right now, at this very moment, in offices, schools, families, in every structure where hierarchies and power differences exist. The true question is not how they selected their victims in antiquity. The real question is, how are they selecting you now? Which of your vulnerabilities are being cataloged at this moment by someone who has cultivated that predatory gaze? At what point did you stop being a subject to become an evaluable object? And the most disturbing question of all, when was the last time you yourself used that gaze, that identified in someone weaker the same vulnerabilities you fear exposing in yourself, that you selected your own victim following exactly the same principles you just read? Because the social predator is not a historical category that we study with morbid fascination from the safety of the present. It is a mirror that reflects something we prefer not to recognize, that we all carry within us the capacity to be both hunter and prey, and that the only difference between the two roles is often simply the opportunity and the right context for that capacity to manifest.